Hey guys, today we're looking at something so familiar you probably haven't questioned it since you were a kid. Most of the world writes with the same hand, throws with the same hand, shakes hands the same way. And yet, when you step back, it's a strangely uneven outcome for a species built on variation. The real mystery isn't that some people are left-handed. It's that we became overwhelmingly right-handed at all. If you enjoy calm, long-form history and the slow unpacking of questions that hide in plain sight, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so these deeper dives show up when they're ready for the next one, and it helps the channel keep making thoughtful, education-first documentaries. Now, to understand how humans became mostly right-handed, we have to do something historians and archaeologists love doing. Follow the trail of tiny, ordinary clues, scratches on stone, where marks on teeth, the layout of tools, and the silent decisions made by communities over thousands of years. This isn't the story of a single inventor, a single decree, or a neat moment when humanity chose the right hand. It's the story of biology meeting culture, brains meeting tools, and individual preference colliding with the social need to coordinate. Let's start with a basic fact that frames everything else. Right-handedness isn't uniquely modern, and it isn't just a habit taught in school. It runs deep. In most human populations studied, roughly 9 out of 10 people prefer the right hand for fine tasks like writing, cutting, or threading a needle. That imbalance is so stable across continents and across centuries that it suggests we're not dealing with a fashion or a passing trend. We're dealing with a long evolutionary outcome shaped by how our bodies and societies work. But how do you see handedness in the distant past, long before writing exercises and classroom discipline? You look for signatures. One of the most compelling lines of evidence comes from stone tools. When a prehistoric napper strikes a stone core to remove flakes, the angles of impact and the orientation of scars can preserve the maker's dominant hand. Over many sites and many assemblages, patterns emerge that are hard to dismiss as coincidence. Another kind of evidence comes from skeletons themselves. The bones of the dominant arm, especially in people who use tools daily, can show subtle differences in strength and thickness. It's not perfect because a life of work strengthens both arms, and lifestyle matters. Still, when combined with tool evidence, it begins to point in the same direction. Right-handed bias appears far back in human prehistory. There's also a wonderfully intimate clue hidden in the mouth. Many ancient people used their front teeth as a third hand, gripping or holding materials while cutting with a stone blade. If you hold something between your teeth and cut downward at an angle, the blade sometimes slips and leaves scratches on the teeth. The direction of those scratches often reflects whether the person held the tool in the right or left hand. Researchers have found right-hand biased scratch patterns in ancient remains, suggesting that the imbalance wasn't produced by modern schooling. It was already there, written in tiny accidents repeated across a lifetime. So if right-handedness is old, what produced it? One major answer takes us into the brain. Human brains are lateralized, meaning certain functions tend to be more dominant in one hemisphere than the other. For most people, language production is concentrated in the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. That doesn't mean language causes right-handedness in a simple, direct way, but it hints at a deep link between fine motor control and the neural systems that specialize in sequencing, timing, and complex coordination. Toolmaking isn't just force. It's planning. It's rhythm. It's order. It's the kind of activity that benefits from a brain that can specialize and streamline. If you imagine early humans learning increasingly complex skills, knapping stone in consistent ways, shaping wood, preparing fibers, later refining metal, the advantage goes to nervous systems that can train one hand to become especially precise. Many animals show a little bit of handedness, but in most species it's closer to a coin flip across the population. What's unusual about humans is not that individuals have a preference, but that the preference lines up across society. And that's where culture enters the picture. Humans don't just live alongside each other. They coordinate. We pass tools, we copy techniques, we hunt together, we build together, we fight information, we teach children by demonstration. In a world where skills are learned socially, a population-level bias can amplify itself. If most adults demonstrate a technique right-handed, most children will find it easier to imitate with the same orientation. Not because they're forced, but because it's simpler. Tool design, too, begins to favor the majority. A knife haft, a spear thrower, later a scythe grip or a shield strap. Small design choices that assume a dominant right hand can make tasks smoother for most people and slightly more awkward for a minority. Over generations, that feedback loop can turn a moderate bias into a strong norm. Yet it's important to be careful here. Cultural pressure alone doesn't fully explain the pattern, because we see right-hand bias in evidence that predates formal institutions. And even in cultures that strongly favored right-handedness in etiquette or ritual, left-handed people never disappeared. That persistence is telling. It suggests that handedness isn't simply taught. It's partly rooted in development and genetics, with culture shaping how comfortable people feel expressing it. So how does biology produce a stable minority of left-handers? One useful way to think about it is that evolution doesn't always drive traits to a single uniform solution. Sometimes it preserves variation because the environment rewards different strategies at different times. Left-handedness can carry small disadvantages in a right-oriented world, tools, scripts, shared practices, but it can also confer occasional advantages, especially in contexts where opponents are less familiar with left-dominant movement. In competitive situations, rarity itself can be an edge. This kind of frequency-dependent advantage doesn't need to be dramatic to matter over long timescales. It only needs to keep left-handedness from being selected out completely. Now, if we shift from deep prehistory into recorded history, the story becomes easier to see because people start talking about hands explicitly. The right hand becomes loaded with meaning. In many traditions, the right hand is associated with skill, strength, trust, and social order. Handshakes, oaths, blessings, these gestures often assume the right hand. The left hand, by contrast, is frequently linked to the awkward, the improper, or the unclean. Some of this symbolism may reflect practical habits. Different hands used for different tasks in societies without modern sanitation, and some reflects the simple fact of majority behavior being turned into moral expectation. When most people do something one way, normal quietly becomes correct. Writing systems likely intensified this, not by creating right-handedness, but by making it more visible. Writing is a public skill. It's taught, evaluated, and standardized. In the ancient world, scribal training demanded consistency. In later centuries, mass schooling did the same. As desks, ink, and penmanship exercises spread, left-handedness could become inconvenient. Smudging ink, awkward posture, different stroke direction, small frictions that can be corrected by adapting tools and methods, but historically were often corrected, by retraining the child. In the 19th and 20th centuries, in many English-speaking countries, left-handed children were sometimes discouraged or forced to switch. That practice left a paper trail: memoirs, teacher manuals, family stories. It also leaves a statistical shadow. In places and periods with strong suppression, reported left-handedness drops, only to rise again when norms relax. That rise doesn't mean left-handedness was invented recently. It means it became safer to admit and easier to accommodate. So far, we've got three interacting layers: a biological bias rooted in brain lateralization, a cultural amplification driven by imitation and tool design, and a historical overlay of symbolism and schooling that could suppress the minority. But there's one more layer that matters: coordination in groups, especially in high-stakes tasks. Consider any activity where timing and orientation have to match: rowing, marching, passing tools along a line, even simple routines like setting a table in a shared space. Uniformity reduces friction. If everyone grips a shield the same way, stands on the same side of a path, or reaches for a shared object with the same hand, small efficiencies accumulate. Early human communities survived on accumulated efficiencies: fewer mistakes, fewer wasted motions, fewer accidents. You don't need a leader to mandate uniformity. It can emerge naturally as the least costly way to live together. Over thousands of years, those small pressures can make a population-level preference more stable. And yet, the story isn't a straight line toward uniformity. Human history is full of local variation. Some tasks encourage ambidexterity, and many people are more flexible than a simple label suggests. Even among right-handed individuals, the non-dominant hand can become highly skilled in supportive roles. Toolmaking itself trains a kind of two-handed intelligence. One hand stabilizes while the other shapes, one hand guides while the other powers. In that sense, the dominance we talk about is often about fine control rather than overall strength. Right-handedness doesn't mean the right hand does everything. It means it leads the most delicate parts of the work. When you put all of this together, the long view becomes clearer. Humans became mostly right-handed not because the right hand is inherently better, but because our brains evolved strong lateralization for complex sequencing tasks, and because our social nature magnified whatever bias existed. Once a majority preference took hold, culture, through tools, traditions, and institutions, reinforced it, sometimes gently through imitation, sometimes harshly through correction. And still, the minority persisted, likely because development and genetics keep producing it, and because rarity can occasionally be useful. The quiet twist in this story is that handedness is both deeply personal and profoundly social. It lives in the wiring of an individual nervous system, but it also lives in the design of a community, its tools, its etiquette, its habits of teaching. That's why the question feels so simple at first and then keeps opening outward. A pen in your hand becomes a map of ancient tool scars, brain hemispheres, schoolrooms, rituals, and the long human struggle to coordinate without losing our individuality. And once you start seeing history that way, through the ordinary details that repeat across generations, you begin to notice how many other natural things are really the product of biology and society shaping each other over time. Handedness is just one of the most visible traces, written into nearly every object we touch. If you'd like, say, continue, and we'll go deeper into the archaeological timelines, the role of tool complexity in early Homo, and how different writing technologies, from clay tablets to ink and paper, quietly pushed the modern world to standardize around the right hand even more. If we slow the timeline down and move further back into the era of early Homo species, the evidence becomes even more fascinating. By the time of Homo heidelbergensis and later Neanderthals, we already see strong signs of population-level right-handedness. This matters because it suggests that the bias predates modern Homo sapiens. In other words, the tendency toward right-hand dominance was likely present in a common ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago. Stone tools from these periods show increasingly standardized production methods. The Acheulean hand axe, for example, was not a random chunk of stone. It required symmetry, planning, and careful sequencing of strikes. Producing one successfully meant holding the core in one hand while striking with the other in controlled rhythms. Over time, such repetitive, skilled action would strengthen neural pathways associated with one dominant side. If most individuals in a group already leaned slightly right, shared learning would magnify that orientation. Neanderthal fossils provide some of the clearest clues. Microscopic analysis of scratches on their front teeth reveals patterns consistent with right-hand tool use. These are not isolated findings from one site but repeated observations across multiple locations. That repetition is important. It reduces the likelihood that we are seeing coincidence or local custom. Instead, it supports the idea of a deeply rooted biological asymmetry. Now consider what this implies about the brain. Brain asymmetry is not unique to humans, but the degree of specialization we show is unusual. The left hemisphere, which controls the right side of the body, is typically dominant not only for language but also for fine motor sequencing. Toolmaking and language share something essential. Both require ordered steps. Both depend on timing, prediction, and hierarchical structuring. Some researchers have proposed that as tool complexity increased, neural systems supporting sequencing became more lateralized. If so, handedness may have strengthened alongside technological advancement. By the Upper Paleolithic period, around 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, humans were creating highly refined blades, bone needles, and composite tools. These required precision. Sewing fitted clothing, carving figurines, shaping spear points, these tasks reward consistency. When most teachers demonstrate these skills with the right hand, apprentices mirror that orientation. Over generations, majority preference becomes embedded not only in biology but in technique. Agriculture adds another layer. Farming tools such as sickles, plows, and later scythes were often designed around dominant use patterns. Even simple repetitive tasks, grinding grain, weaving textiles, shaping pottery, can subtly favor one orientation in communal settings. When toolmakers design for the majority, they unintentionally make life slightly more awkward for the minority. Over centuries, that difference accumulates. Writing systems further intensified directional bias. In left-to-right scripts such as Greek, Latin, and later English, right-handed writers can pull the writing instrument across the page without dragging the hand through fresh ink. Left-handed writers often have to push or angle differently to avoid smudging. While this does not determine handedness, it affects comfort and perceived correctness. As literacy became institutionalized, especially in Europe and later in North America and Australia, uniform penmanship standards amplified the right-hand norm. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, formal schooling sometimes enforced conformity. Historical records from Britain, the United States, and Canada show that left-handed children were occasionally retrained. This practice likely suppressed visible left-handedness in earlier statistics. When social pressure relaxed in the mid-20th century, reported left-handedness increased. Importantly, this rise plateaued around the familiar 10% mark, suggesting that biology sets a baseline while culture modifies expression. So the long arc of handedness is not a simple march toward uniformity. It is a layered process. Evolution appears to have established a population bias linked to brain lateralization and fine motor specialization. Social learning amplified it. Tool design reinforced it. Symbolism justified it. Education sometimes enforced it. And yet, throughout all of this, variation endured. The remarkable thing is stability. Across continents and across millennia, the ratio remains similar. That consistency hints at a balance point, an equilibrium shaped by neurological development, social coordination, and subtle evolutionary pressures. Humans became mostly right-handed not through a single turning point, but through countless small reinforcements repeated over deep time. And when we look at our own hands today, resting on a keyboard, holding a cup, turning a page, we are participating in a pattern that stretches back far beyond written history. There is also a broader evolutionary question that historians and biologists continue to explore. Why would strong lateralization become so characteristic of our species in the first place? One explanation centers on efficiency. The brain is an energy-demanding organ. Specializing certain tasks in one hemisphere may reduce redundancy and improve processing speed. If language, fine motor control, and sequencing become concentrated primarily in the left hemisphere for most individuals, the neural system may operate with greater clarity and less internal competition. This specialization would have had practical consequences. Early humans depended on increasingly complex cooperation. Coordinated hunting strategies, food preparation, shelter construction, and eventually symbolic communication required predictable patterns of action. When most individuals share a similar motor dominance, imitation becomes easier. Teaching becomes clearer. Collective tasks become smoother. In evolutionary terms, even small improvements in coordination can translate into meaningful survival advantages over thousands of generations. Yet the persistence of left-handedness reminds us that evolution rarely eliminates variation entirely. Genetic studies suggest that handedness is influenced by multiple genes rather than a single dominant switch. Development in the womb, subtle hormonal influences, and early neural organization also play roles. Rather than producing a fixed destiny, biology seems to set probabilities. Most individuals develop right-hand preference, some develop left, and a smaller percentage display mixed dominance. It is also worth noting that handedness is not identical across all activities. A person may write with the right hand but prefer the left for certain sports or fine manipulations. This flexibility indicates that dominance exists along a spectrum. What we call right-handed humanity is really a statistical pattern, not an absolute rule. Cultural meanings layered on top of this pattern often reveal more about society than about biology. In many languages, words associated with the right side historically carried positive connotations: correctness, skill, legitimacy. The English word right itself implies both direction and moral correctness. Meanwhile, words derived from the Latin for left, sinister, took on darker associations. These linguistic developments likely reflect majority bias rather than inherent moral judgment, but once embedded in language, they shape perception. As global communication expanded and scientific understanding improved, attitudes toward handedness gradually shifted. By the late 20th century, educators in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia increasingly recognized that forcing a change in dominance could cause frustration without delivering real benefit. Accommodation became standard. Desks, scissors, and writing techniques adapted. This shift provides an interesting modern case study of how cultural reinforcement can soften without altering the underlying biological distribution. Today, neuroscience continues to investigate the relationship between handedness and brain organization. Imaging studies confirm that while most right-handed individuals show left hemisphere language dominance, left-handed individuals display more variation. Some mirror the typical pattern, others show more bilateral distribution. This diversity suggests that the human brain remains adaptable, even within broad statistical trends. When viewed across the full sweep of history, from stone flakes struck hundreds of thousands of years ago to classrooms adjusting seating arrangements, the story of handedness becomes a quiet illustration of how biology and culture intertwine. It is not dramatic in the way of wars or empires, but it is foundational. It shapes how tools are built, how scripts are written, how gestures become ritualized, and how individuals experience their own bodies within society. Humans became mostly right-handed through a long accumulation of neural specialization, social imitation, technological design, and cultural reinforcement. The pattern stabilized because it worked well enough for collective life, yet variation endured because diversity itself carries resilience. And in that balance between uniformity and individuality, we see something deeply characteristic of our species. If you look at your dominant hand now, you are seeing not just a personal habit, but the outcome of a process that has been unfolding since long before recorded history, a subtle but enduring signature of what it means to be human. One of the most revealing aspects of this story is how invisible it feels. Unlike the rise of agriculture or the fall of empires, handedness rarely announces itself as history. It operates quietly, shaping the physical world in small but consistent ways. Look closely at everyday objects, door handles, camera shutters, measuring tapes, musical instruments, even the layout of computer mice, and you will often find an assumption built into their design. That assumption reflects the statistical majority. In earlier centuries, the bias could be even more pronounced. Consider the architecture of defensive structures in medieval Europe. Spiral staircases in castles frequently turned clockwise as they ascended. For a right-handed defender descending the stairs, the orientation allowed greater freedom of movement for the sword arm. For an attacker moving upward, the inner wall restricted the swing of a right-handed weapon. While not every staircase followed this pattern, the prevalence suggests that architects were thinking about the dominant fighting hand of most warriors. Even in stone and mortar, handedness left its trace. Military drill offers another example. Coordinated movement, marching in step, presenting arms, executing turns, relies on uniform orientation. Standardizing which hand carries a weapon or performs a gesture reduces confusion. Once standardized, the practice reinforces itself through repetition. New recruits learn by imitation, and deviation becomes noticeable. Over time, uniformity feels natural, even inevitable. Music and craftsmanship reveal similar patterns. Many string instruments, from violins to guitars, are built with right-hand plucking or bowing in mind. While left-handed versions exist today, historically they were uncommon. Workshop tools, planes, saws, looms, often reflected the dominant hand of their makers. When a toolmaker is right-handed, the ergonomics of design may subtly favor that perspective. This does not mean left-handed individuals could not adapt, but adaptation often required extra effort. Yet despite centuries of reinforcement, left-handed individuals consistently appear in historical records as artisans, leaders, athletes, and thinkers. Their presence reminds us that minority traits can persist robustly within majority systems. In fact, in certain competitive settings, particularly in direct physical contests, left-handedness can create strategic unpredictability. Because most people train and practice against right-handed opponents, facing a left-handed competitor introduces unfamiliar angles and timing. This phenomenon has been observed in various sports and may reflect a broader evolutionary principle. When a trait is rare, its rarity can itself be advantageous in specific contexts. From a developmental standpoint, handedness begins to express itself early in childhood. Infants may show preferences in reaching or grasping, though stable dominance often becomes clearer later. Importantly, the choice is not conscious in the way selecting a favorite color might be. It emerges from neural wiring patterns shaped before birth and refined through early experience. When children were historically pressured to switch hands, many complied outwardly but retained internal dominance patterns. Some experienced confusion or reduced fluency in fine motor tasks. Over time, educational systems recognized that supporting natural preference led to better outcomes. Modern neuroscience adds nuance to our understanding. Brain imaging shows that lateralization is not absolute. Even in strongly right-handed individuals, the right hemisphere contributes meaningfully to many tasks. Likewise, left-handed individuals often show more distributed processing. Rather than two rigid halves, the brain functions as a dynamic network with tendencies toward specialization. Handedness is one visible expression of that deeper organization. What makes the long history of right-handedness compelling is not simply its dominance, but its durability. Across prehistoric toolmakers, ancient scribes, medieval builders, early modern soldiers, and industrial-era students, the pattern remains remarkably stable. Culture can amplify or soften its visibility, but the underlying distribution shifts only within narrow bounds. In that sense, handedness offers a model for understanding human history more broadly. Some traits are shaped by deep biological currents that move slowly and resist dramatic change. Others are sculpted rapidly by institutions and ideas. The story of how humans became mostly right-handed sits at the intersection of those forces. It reminds us that even the most ordinary features of daily life carry the imprint of ancient evolutionary pathways and centuries of shared adaptation. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of this topic. It asks us to notice what usually goes unnoticed. In the simple act of reaching, writing, or lifting, we are participating in a pattern that began long before written language, and that continues subtly but persistently to shape the human experience. If we widen the lens even further, handedness becomes part of a larger pattern of asymmetry in the human body and brain. The heart leans slightly to the left. One hemisphere tends to dominate language. One hand tends to master precision. Symmetry may appear aesthetically pleasing, but functionally, living systems often benefit from division of labor. Specialization allows for refinement. In the case of humans, that refinement supported increasingly complex toolkits, social systems, and symbolic communication. Archaeologists sometimes describe human technological history as an upward curve of complexity. Early stone flakes gave way to standardized hand axes, which gave way to blades, composite weapons, agricultural tools, metalworking, and eventually machinery. At every stage, skill transmission was essential. And skill transmission depends on clarity. When a master demonstrates a technique the same way each time, learners can internalize the pattern more reliably. If most masters happen to be right-handed, the demonstration itself becomes a stabilizing force. This effect compounds in literate societies. Once writing spreads, scripts become standardized, and so do the movements that produce them. In English-speaking regions, writing flows from left to right across the page. This orientation aligns smoothly with right-hand movement, especially when ink and paper are involved. While left-handed writers can and do adapt successfully, historical tools did not always accommodate them comfortably. Over centuries, the physical experience of writing reinforced the perception that right-handedness was normal. Industrialization added another dimension. Mass production favors uniform design. When factories manufacture tools, desks, or household objects at scale, designing for the majority makes economic sense. The more standardized the design, the lower the cost. As these products fill homes and schools, they quietly reinforce the dominant orientation. This is not a conspiracy or deliberate exclusion. It is a statistical outcome shaped by efficiency. At the same time, the 20th century brought increased scientific curiosity about individual differences. Psychologists began measuring handedness systematically rather than assuming it. Large-scale surveys in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia revealed similar ratios across diverse populations. As stigma decreased, self-reporting became more accurate. What emerged was not a sudden surge of left-handedness, but confirmation of a long-standing distribution. There is also an intriguing connection between handedness and creativity that has attracted attention, though it must be handled cautiously. Some studies suggest slightly higher representation of left-handed individuals in certain artistic or spatial professions. However, these patterns are modest and not universal. What they may reflect is not inherent creative superiority, but neurological diversity. A brain organized differently may approach problems from different angles. Diversity in cognitive wiring can enrich a population, even if it remains numerically smaller. Ultimately, the dominance of the right hand in human societies appears to be the product of layered reinforcement across time. Evolution established a bias through brain lateralization. Cooperative living amplified it through imitation and coordination. Technological design embedded it in material culture. Institutions sometimes enforced it. Yet biological variation ensured that the minority endured, contributing its own strengths and perspectives. When we step back, the story feels less like a mystery with a single answer and more like a tapestry woven from many threads. Handedness is a small detail in the grand sweep of history, but it reveals something fundamental about how humans evolve, not just biologically but socially. Traits emerge, societies adapt around them, and those adaptations in turn shape experience. So the next time you notice which hand reaches first, consider the depth behind that motion. It connects you to ancient toolmakers shaping stone under open skies, to scribes bent over parchment, to factory designers calibrating assembly lines, and to neuroscientists mapping hemispheres in quiet laboratories. A simple preference becomes a window into the long, steady dialogue between nature and culture that defines our species. There is one final perspective that brings this entire story into sharper focus. The idea that handedness reflects how humans balance uniformity and diversity at the same time. Our species thrives on cooperation. We build systems, languages, and institutions that function best when people can anticipate one another's actions. Shared direction, literal and symbolic, reduces friction. If most people reach, grasp, signal, and demonstrate in similar ways, coordination becomes easier. In early communities where survival depended on smooth cooperation, even minor efficiencies could matter. And yet, humans also thrive on variation. Genetic diversity strengthens resilience. Cognitive diversity strengthens problem-solving. The persistence of left-handedness across tens of thousands of years suggests that complete uniformity was never the goal of evolution. Instead, the distribution appears to hover at a stable ratio, large enough for right-handed coordination to dominate, small enough for variation to remain part of the population. From an anthropological standpoint, this balance is revealing. Many social norms begin as simple majority behaviors. Over time, those behaviors gather meaning. What starts as statistical prevalence can evolve into ritual preference. In some cultures, the right hand became associated with formal greetings, gift-giving, or sacred gestures. These customs reinforced the dominant orientation without necessarily understanding its biological roots. The symbolism followed the statistics. Modern global society, however, has begun to separate symbolism from science. Increased awareness of neurological development has reframed handedness as a natural variation rather than a moral or social deviation. Educational systems now emphasize accommodation rather than correction. Left-handed scissors, adaptable workspaces, and digital tools have softened practical disadvantages. As a result, handedness today feels less constrained by social pressure than it did a century ago. Technology may even be reducing the physical visibility of dominance. Typing on keyboards requires coordinated use of both hands. Touchscreens respond equally to either side. Voice recognition minimizes manual input altogether. While right-handed design assumptions still exist, digital environments are more flexible than ink and paper once were. In that sense, modern life may be gently decoupling social practice from ancient asymmetry. Still, the biological pattern remains. Roughly 90% of people prefer the right hand for fine tasks. That consistency across geography and time underscores how deeply rooted the phenomenon is. It is not the product of one culture or one historical moment. It is a signature of human neural organization that predates agriculture, predates cities, and likely predates our own species. The quiet power of this topic lies in its ordinariness. Handedness does not reshape borders or topple governments. It does not dominate textbooks, but it influences architecture, tool design, military drill, art, writing, and education. It touches daily life at a scale so constant that it disappears into habit. In tracing how humans became mostly right-handed, we uncover a pattern of interaction between brain structure, evolutionary pressure, social imitation, and institutional reinforcement. No single factor explains it alone. Together, they create stability without eliminating diversity. And perhaps that is the deeper historical lesson. Human development is rarely driven by dramatic turning points alone. More often, it unfolds through steady reinforcement. Small tendencies amplified over immense stretches of time. A preference becomes a pattern. A pattern becomes a norm. A norm becomes embedded in material culture. And through it all, the underlying biological variation continues quietly in the background. So when you lift your dominant hand again, whether to write, gesture, or simply rest it on a desk, you are participating in a continuum that stretches back through prehistoric campsites and forward into digital futures. It is a subtle inheritance, but a profound one, reminding us that even the simplest human traits carry the weight of deep history. As we bring the story toward the present, it becomes clear that handedness is not just an evolutionary artifact or a cultural habit. It is a living example of how deeply the past remains embedded in the present. The overwhelming dominance of the right hand is not loudly enforced anymore, yet it continues quietly because it has been reinforced for so long at so many levels: biological, practical, and symbolic. Consider how early humans likely experienced handedness. There were no labels, no surveys, no awareness of statistical norms. A child reached for a stone, a tool, a piece of food, and gradually one hand proved more precise. That preference was refined through repetition. In small bands of hunter-gatherers, imitation would have been immediate and personal. A child copying an elder's movements would likely mirror the orientation most frequently seen. Over time, this subtle copying behavior would create alignment within the group without conscious planning. As societies grew more complex, the feedback loops multiplied. Writing required standardized motion. Craft guilds required precise apprenticeship. Military formations required synchronized action. Even religious rituals required coordinated gestures. Each layer of complexity favored predictability. If 9 out of 10 people already leaned right, the remaining one would adapt within systems not designed specifically for them. Adaptation, however, did not erase their presence. What is remarkable is that the ratio has remained so stable despite centuries of pressure in some regions to suppress left-handedness. This suggests that handedness is not easily overridden by environment alone. It arises from early neural development, likely influenced by a mixture of genetic tendencies and prenatal conditions. Culture can shape expression, but it does not rewrite the underlying blueprint. Today, neuroscientists continue exploring how lateralization connects to other aspects of cognition. Some research examines links between handedness and language processing, spatial reasoning, or even emotional regulation. The findings are nuanced. While trends exist, there is enormous individual variation. This reinforces a broader truth. Handedness is one dimension of human diversity, not a rigid category that determines personality or ability. In a globalized world, awareness of diversity has grown. Tools and technologies are increasingly designed with flexibility in mind. Digital interfaces allow customization. Manufacturing can produce smaller batches for minority needs. Where once a left-handed student might have been told to conform, now accommodations are routine. The story has shifted from correction to inclusion, and yet the dominance of the right hand remains visible everywhere, from the orientation of spiral notebooks to the placement of camera controls. These are not relics of prejudice but reflections of probability. Design follows the majority. The majority, in turn, reflects ancient biological patterns shaped long before modern culture. If there is a quiet lesson in this history, It is about how gradual processes shape humanity more profoundly than sudden events. There was no single moment when humans became right-handed. There was no decree, no discovery, no decisive turning point. Instead, there were countless small reinforcements over vast stretches of time. Brain lateralization encouraged a bias. Social imitation amplified it. Tool design embedded it. Institutions formalized it. Variation persisted within it. In the end, handedness is a subtle thread woven through the fabric of human evolution and civilization. It connects prehistoric toolmakers to modern students, ancient architects to industrial designers, neural circuits to social customs. It reminds us that history does not live only in monuments and manuscripts. It lives in habits, gestures, and the quiet mechanics of the body itself. And perhaps that is what makes this story so compelling. In the simple act of reaching out your dominant hand, you are participating in a pattern older than writing, older than cities, older than recorded memory. A small, ordinary motion carries within it the weight of deep time, a quiet testament to how biology and culture have shaped us, together, across the long arc of human history. If we take one last step back, handedness also invites us to reflect on how historians reconstruct the past from patterns that seem almost too ordinary to matter. A scratch on a fossilized tooth, a wear mark on a stone blade, the orientation of a staircase, the direction of ink across parchment. None of these pieces alone tells the full story, but together they reveal a consistent human tendency that stretches across continents and millennia. That consistency is striking because human cultures vary enormously in language, belief, diet, climate, and technology. Yet, in this one respect, they converge. From Paleolithic campsites in Europe to early agricultural settlements in the Near East, from classical Mediterranean scribes to medieval English craftsmen, from indigenous communities in North America to settlers in Australia, the majority preference remains the same. Such global stability strongly suggests that handedness is not primarily a cultural invention. Culture magnifies it, but biology anchors it. At the same time, the social meaning attached to handedness demonstrates how quickly humans layer symbolism onto biological facts. Once a majority pattern becomes visible, it can acquire moral or ritual weight. The right hand becomes associated with trust, legitimacy, or authority simply because it is statistically dominant. Language absorbs the bias. Customs formalize it. Over centuries, what began as a neurological probability becomes part of the moral vocabulary of a society. Yet modern understanding has gently dismantled those symbolic hierarchies. Science reframes handedness not as virtue or defect, but as variation. This shift reflects a broader pattern in history, the movement from symbolic interpretation toward empirical explanation. Where earlier eras saw meaning in asymmetry, contemporary research sees developmental pathways and neural architecture. Even so, the ancient distribution remains unchanged. Roughly 9 out of 10 humans prefer the right hand for fine motor tasks. This stability over such vast time suggests that the ratio itself may represent a kind of evolutionary balance point. Too little lateralization might reduce efficiency in complex tasks. Too much uniformity might eliminate beneficial variation. The current proportion appears to maintain both coordination and diversity. In practical terms, this means that the physical world around us will likely continue to reflect right-hand bias. Not because societies wish to exclude, but because design follows numbers. However, awareness now allows flexibility. Tools can be adapted. Interfaces can be mirrored. What was once rigid has become adjustable. Ultimately, the story of how humans became mostly right-handed is less about hands and more about the deep partnership between biology and society. It shows how subtle neural tendencies can ripple outward into architecture, education, ritual, and technology. It demonstrates how majority behaviors solidify into norms, and how norms can later be softened by knowledge. Most importantly, it reminds us that history lives not only in grand events but in the everyday mechanics of life. The hand you use to write, to gesture, to lift a cup of tea or coffee, carries within it a lineage older than recorded language. It is shaped by hemispheres of the brain that specialized hundreds of thousands of years ago. It is reinforced by teachers, tools, and traditions that accumulated layer by layer. So when we ask how humans became mostly right-handed, the answer is not a single cause but a long convergence. Evolution provided the bias. Cooperation strengthened it. Culture encoded it. And time, steady, patient time, made it the quiet norm of our species. There is something quietly humbling about realizing that even our most automatic movements are shaped by forces stretching back into prehistory. Handedness feels personal. It feels like a simple fact about who we are. Yet when examined historically, it becomes clear that this small preference connects each of us to a chain of biological development and social adaptation that began long before our names, nations, or languages existed. If early humans had evolved without strong brain lateralization, the story might have looked very different. Tool use may have remained less specialized. Language processing might have developed along alternate neural pathways. The efficiency gained from concentrating certain tasks within one hemisphere could have been weaker. Instead, evolution appears to have favored asymmetry. Once that asymmetry took hold, social living amplified its effects. Human beings do not simply survive individually. We survive collectively. Coordination matters. Teaching matters. Shared habits matter. When a community shares a dominant orientation, its members can anticipate one another's actions more easily. Passing tools, aligning shields, writing scripts, organizing workspaces, all become slightly smoother. Over countless generations, these small efficiencies accumulate. At the same time, left-handed individuals never vanished. Their continued presence across every documented era suggests resilience built into human development itself. Variation persists because the mechanisms that produce handedness are complex and probabilistic. There is no single switch that can be permanently turned off. This complexity ensures that even in societies where conformity was once encouraged, diversity quietly reemerged. Modern science, with its imaging technologies and genetic studies, has not overturned the broad historical pattern. Instead, it has deepened our understanding of it. We now know that handedness reflects broader hemispheric specialization. We know that language, sequencing, and fine motor control often cluster within the same neural territory. We know that development in the womb plays a role long before social influence begins. What historians inferred from stone tools and skeletal remains, neuroscience now supports from inside the skull. Yet perhaps the most important insight is philosophical rather than technical. Handedness reminds us that not all historical change is dramatic. Some patterns stabilize and endure. They do not demand attention. They do not produce headlines. They simply persist, shaping daily experience in ways so constant that they disappear into the background. From Paleolithic toolmakers shaping flint under open skies to medieval scribes copying manuscripts by candlelight, from early modern soldiers drilling in formation to students today typing on laptops, the dominant hand has remained mostly the same. The tools have evolved. The environments have transformed. The civilizations have risen and fallen. But the ratio endures. In that endurance, we see the quiet power of evolutionary history. We see how a biological bias can become embedded in architecture, language, education, and design without ever being consciously planned. We see how society can reinforce a pattern without fully understanding its origins. And we see how modern knowledge can soften rigid interpretations without altering the underlying distribution. So the next time you notice your dominant hand moving almost automatically, signing a document, stirring a cup, reaching for a door, you might pause for a moment. That motion is not just a habit. It is an inheritance. It carries the imprint of ancient neural specialization, cooperative survival, and centuries of cultural reinforcement. How humans became mostly right-handed is not the story of a decision. It is the story of convergence. Biology, cooperation, technology, and time aligned in one direction. And through that alignment, a simple preference became one of the most stable patterns in the entire human story. If we allow ourselves one final reflection, it becomes clear that handedness is a quiet example of how deeply time shapes the human condition. There was never a council where early humans decided that the right hand would lead. There was no proclamation, no turning point, no revolution of preference. Instead, there was a subtle neurological tilt, small at first, toward left hemisphere specialization. That tilt favored fine motor sequencing on the right side of the body. From there, the long amplification began. In prehistoric camps, a child watching an elder shape stone would mirror the movement that appeared most often. In early farming communities, tools were passed down and refined in ways that fit the majority grip. In ancient workshops, scribes trained apprentices in scripts that flowed most comfortably under right-handed control. In medieval training grounds, synchronized drills quietly assumed a common dominant side. None of these steps required awareness of evolution or neuroscience. They required only repetition. What makes this process remarkable is its steadiness. Human history is often described through upheaval, wars, migrations, technological revolutions. Yet beneath those dramatic shifts, certain biological patterns persist almost untouched. Handedness is one of them. Civilizations rise and fall, languages emerge and disappear, belief systems transform, but roughly 9 out of 10 humans continue to favor the right hand for precision tasks. Even as modern societies have become more inclusive and flexible, the underlying ratio remains stable. We can now design tools that accommodate either hand. We can arrange classrooms and workspaces without bias. We can understand the neurological roots of dominance rather than attaching symbolism to it. And yet, the distribution does not swing wildly in response. It remains anchored in developmental biology. This stability suggests that handedness sits at an equilibrium point, strong enough to provide population-wide coordination, flexible enough to preserve minority variation. Too little lateralization might reduce efficiency in complex tasks. Too much uniformity might erase beneficial diversity. The current balance appears to have served our species well across vast stretches of time. There is also something deeply human in the way culture responded to this imbalance. Societies noticed the majority pattern and gradually attached meaning to it. Language fused right with correctness. Rituals favored one side for greetings or vows. Educational systems once attempted to standardize children around what felt normal. These responses were not malicious inventions. They were extensions of a visible majority into social expectation. Over time, knowledge corrected excess rigidity, but the original pattern remained. In the 21st century, as technology reshapes how we interact with the world, the physical dominance of one hand may feel less pronounced. Touchscreens respond equally to either thumb. Voice commands bypass manual orientation altogether. Digital tools can be mirrored instantly. Yet even here, subtle defaults often reflect the ancient ratio. The position of a mouse, the layout of controls, the orientation of certain gestures, all quietly echo the same long-standing distribution. And so we arrive at the quiet conclusion of this long journey. How humans became mostly right-handed is not a mystery solved by a single discovery. It is a layered narrative of evolutionary specialization, cooperative reinforcement, material design, and cultural meaning. It is a story written not in dramatic episodes, but in repeated motions across millennia. Every time an early human struck flint with practiced rhythm, every time a scribe drew ink across parchment, every time a teacher guided a child's hand across a page, the pattern strengthened, not through intention but through continuity. The right hand led because the brain favored it slightly. Society followed because coordination favored simplicity. Variation endured because biology is never absolute. In that sense, handedness offers a profound reminder. The most enduring features of humanity are not always the loudest. Some of them live in the quiet mechanics of our bodies, subtle asymmetries that shape tools, traditions, and technologies without demanding attention. When you lift your dominant hand now, you are not just performing a simple action. You are expressing an inheritance older than cities, older than writing, older even than our own species in its current form. It is a small movement carrying the weight of deep time, a testament to how biology and culture have moved together, steadily and silently, across the vast arc of human history. As we close this exploration, it is worth reflecting on how rarely we pause to consider the deep origins of ordinary behavior. Handedness feels instinctive, almost invisible. Yet behind that instinct lies a chain of developments stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. It is a reminder that evolution does not only shape bones and muscles, it shapes patterns of action, repetition, and coordination that ripple outward into culture. Imagine the earliest members of the genus Homo standing on open savanna landscapes, experimenting with stone. Each strike required control, anticipation, and feedback. The brain rewarded efficiency. If one hemisphere proved slightly more adept at organizing fine sequences of motion, that advantage compounded through practice. Over generations, the neural bias became more pronounced. And because humans are intensely social learners, the preference did not remain isolated within individuals. It became visible in the group. That visibility mattered. In cooperative species, predictability reduces friction. When most individuals favor the same orientation, shared tasks align more naturally. Passing objects, coordinating hunts, building shelters. all become subtly smoother. The advantage may have been small in any single moment, but across thousands of years, small advantages accumulate. Cultural transmission magnified what biology initiated. By the time writing systems emerged in ancient civilizations, the right-hand majority was already deeply established. Scripts flowed in directions that often favored right-handed motion, especially in cultures using ink and parchment. As formal education developed, instruction methods unconsciously reflected the dominant orientation. In some periods, especially in parts of Europe and North America, left-handed children were encouraged or required to adapt. Yet, even those social pressures did not erase the minority. They only masked it temporarily. The resilience of left-handedness is one of the most telling aspects of the story. It suggests that variation is embedded in the developmental processes of our species. Genetic influences appear to set probabilities rather than fixed outcomes. Prenatal factors contribute subtle shifts. The result is a stable distribution that resists extreme change. Even in societies that once discouraged left-handedness, the long-term proportion eventually returned to its familiar range once pressure eased. Modern neuroscience deepens this understanding. Brain imaging confirms that lateralization is common but not identical across individuals. While most right-handed people show left hemisphere dominance for language, left-handed individuals often display more varied patterns. This diversity underscores a broader truth. Human brains are not mirror copies of one another. Handedness is one outward expression of deeper internal variation. Today, technology offers more accommodation than ever before. Tools can be redesigned. Interfaces can be flipped. Classrooms can adapt without difficulty. Yet the ancient pattern remains statistically steady. That steadiness is perhaps the clearest evidence that handedness is not primarily a social invention. It is a biological tendency shaped long before written history began. And so the story returns to its quiet center. Humans became mostly right-handed through gradual convergence, through neural specialization, social imitation, technological reinforcement, and the steady passage of time. No dramatic shift, no decisive event, no single explanation stands alone. Instead, the pattern emerged from the interaction of many small forces operating consistently over immense stretches of history. When we look at our dominant hand now, resting on a desk or guiding a pen, we are seeing more than habit. We are seeing the trace of evolutionary asymmetry. We are seeing the imprint of cooperation that shaped early communities. We are seeing the quiet influence of tools, scripts, classrooms, and design choices layered across centuries. In a world often defined by rapid change, handedness stands as a symbol of continuity. Civilizations transform, technologies evolve, beliefs shift, yet the human tendency toward right-hand dominance remains largely unchanged. It is a subtle inheritance, one that binds modern lives to ancient ancestors through the simplest of gestures. And perhaps that is the lasting insight. History is not only written in monuments and manuscripts. It is written in movement, in the repeated, everyday actions that carry the weight of deep time. There is one more dimension worth considering, and it brings us into the realm of identity. For most people, handedness is discovered rather than chosen. It emerges gradually in childhood, often without conscious awareness. A toddler reaches repeatedly with one hand. A pencil feels steadier in a particular grip. Over time, the preference settles. That quiet settling reflects developmental pathways shaped long before memory begins. It is one of the earliest signals that the brain is organizing itself asymmetrically. From a historical perspective, this is powerful. It means that every generation reenacts, in miniature, a pattern that took shape over evolutionary time. Each child's developing nervous system recapitulates the broader story of hemispheric specialization. And when that child enters society, into family life, schoolrooms, workshops, the biological tendency encounters cultural structure. Most of the time, the two align seamlessly. Occasionally, they do not. But either way, the interaction is ancient. Handedness also subtly shapes perception. The dominant hand often leads fine motor tasks, while the non-dominant hand stabilizes or supports. This division of labor encourages coordination between hemispheres of the brain. In a sense, handedness trains cooperation within the body itself. One side refines, the other assists. That internal partnership mirrors the external cooperation that defined early human communities. Throughout history, societies interpreted this asymmetry in different ways. In some cultures, the right hand was linked to formal acts of exchange, offering, receiving, pledging. The left might be reserved for more practical or private tasks. These customs likely grew from majority behavior combined with hygiene norms and ritual symbolism. Over centuries, such associations became embedded in etiquette and language. Yet even where symbolism attached value to one side, the underlying biological distribution remained constant. The scientific era gradually reframed the discussion. By the 19th century, researchers began systematically observing handedness rather than moralizing about it. By the 20th century, psychologists and neurologists studied it as a window into brain organization. As data accumulated, the narrative shifted from superstition to structure. The right-hand majority was no longer proof of moral alignment. It was evidence of lateralized neural networks. This transition reflects a broader movement in human history, the shift from symbolic explanation toward empirical inquiry. Where earlier societies interpreted difference through myth or ritual, modern science investigates developmental processes and genetic influences. Handedness, once charged with meaning, became a measurable trait with biological roots. That shift did not alter the ratio, but it altered how societies responded to it. In practical terms, contemporary life offers unprecedented adaptability. Workspaces can be rearranged. Sports training acknowledges diversity of orientation. Educational systems encourage natural development rather than correction. Technology, especially digital technology, has reduced physical constraints tied to writing direction or tool design. Yet, despite these accommodations, the global proportion remains remarkably stable. That constancy underscores how deeply the pattern is anchored in human biology. Looking across the entire arc, from prehistoric toolmakers to modern neuroscientists, we see that handedness is less about superiority and more about specialization. The dominance of the right hand does not imply universal advantage. It reflects the brain's preference for organizing complex sequences within a particular hemisphere. Once established, that specialization influenced how societies built tools, trained children, and structured ritual. And so, at the end of this long exploration, the answer to how humans became mostly right-handed feels both simple and profound. A slight neurological bias emerged deep in evolutionary time. Cooperative living amplified it. Material culture reinforced it. Social institutions occasionally overemphasized it. Variation persisted within it. Across millennia, the balance held steady. What remains is an enduring pattern, one that lives quietly in daily life. Each time you reach for a glass, sign your name, or gesture in conversation, you participate in a story older than civilization itself. It is a reminder that history is not only preserved in ruins and records. It is preserved in the body, in asymmetry, in motion. Humanity's right-hand majority is not the result of a decision, nor the product of a single era. It is the outcome of deep biological architecture meeting social adaptation over immense stretches of time. And in that convergence, we glimpse something essential about our species. We are shaped by both nature and culture, intertwined so thoroughly that even the smallest gesture carries the imprint of ancient history. If we linger just a little longer on this subject, one final insight begins to emerge. Handedness is a reminder that human history operates on multiple timescales at once. On the surface, societies transform rapidly. Empires rise and fall within centuries. Technologies overturn daily routines in a single generation. Yet beneath those visible shifts, biological patterns move slowly, almost imperceptibly, across vast stretches of time. Handedness belongs to that slower layer of history. Long before cities, long before agriculture, long before writing, the human brain had already begun to favor asymmetry. The left hemisphere, in most individuals, specialized in sequencing and language-like processing. That specialization subtly encouraged more refined control of the right hand. At first, the difference may have been modest, a slight advantage in precision. But in a species that depended increasingly on tools and cooperation, modest advantages mattered. Imagine small groups gathered around a shared task: shaping stone, preparing hides, weaving fibers. The majority orientation becomes the most visible orientation. Children copy what they see most often. Tools are shaped to fit the grip most frequently used. Nothing about this requires deliberate planning. It is simply the natural consequence of statistical majority interacting with social learning. Over tens of thousands of years, this quiet feedback loop deepened. By the time early civilizations formed in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and later across Europe and the Americas, the right-hand majority was already ancient. Writing systems emerged within that context. In many regions, scripts developed directions and stroke patterns that worked smoothly for right-handed scribes. Over centuries, those conventions solidified into tradition. What is striking is that even where script direction differed, such as right-to-left systems, the overall global ratio of handedness remains similar. This suggests that writing did not create the imbalance. It adapted to one that already existed. Culture responded to biology more often than it reshaped it. During periods when left-handedness was discouraged, especially in certain Western school systems of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the suppression was social rather than biological. Once the pressure lifted, the visible proportion returned to its familiar range. That rebound is powerful evidence. It shows that while culture can influence expression, it rarely overrides deep developmental tendencies. In the modern era, we often speak about inclusivity and design flexibility. Left-handed tools are widely available. Digital platforms can be mirrored instantly. There is far less stigma attached to minority orientation. And yet, the statistical balance persists almost unchanged. Roughly 9 out of 10 humans continue to favor the right hand for fine motor tasks. This constancy invites reflection. Handedness is not about superiority or correctness. It is about specialization within a cooperative species. The right-hand majority likely facilitated smoother group coordination over evolutionary time. The left-hand minority likely persisted because variation carries subtle advantages and because developmental systems are probabilistic rather than fixed. Seen this way, handedness becomes a quiet symbol of human balance. We are unified enough to coordinate at large scales, yet diverse enough to retain individual variation. We standardize tools for efficiency, yet adapt them when awareness grows. We inherit biological tendencies, yet reinterpret them through evolving cultural values. Perhaps the most meaningful takeaway is this: the simplest features of daily life often carry the deepest histories. A handshake, a signature, the way you hold a fork. These gestures seem trivial, but behind them lies an ancient neural architecture, shaped long before recorded memory. That architecture influenced tool design, ritual practice, military formation, educational norms, and industrial production. It quietly shaped the physical world around us, and still it operates without fanfare. Humans became mostly right-handed not through decree or design, but through convergence, evolutionary asymmetry meeting social amplification over immense time. It is a story without a single dramatic turning point, yet it spans the entire arc of our species. So when you lift your dominant hand again, consider the depth behind that motion. It connects you to prehistoric toolmakers, to ancient scribes, to medieval builders, to modern scientists mapping hemispheres of the brain. It is a small gesture carrying a vast inheritance, a living trace of how biology and culture have shaped humanity together, steadily and silently, across the long sweep of history. As we draw this long examination to its natural close, it is worth considering how handedness fits into the broader narrative of what makes humans distinct. Our species is defined not only by intelligence, language, and technology, but by the intricate coordination between body and brain. Handedness is one of the clearest outward signs of that coordination. It is the visible edge of an invisible architecture. Deep within the skull, hemispheres specialize. Neural circuits organize tasks with remarkable efficiency. Fine motor control, speech production, and complex sequencing often cluster in predictable patterns. Over evolutionary time, those patterns provided advantages: clearer communication, more reliable tool production, more coordinated social interaction. The dominance of the right hand for most individuals is not random. It is a surface expression of that deeper structural arrangement. And yet, what makes this story especially human is the way biology and culture continually influence one another. Once the right-hand majority was established, society adapted around it. Tools were shaped for that grip. Writing systems flowed in ways that suited it. Ritual gestures reinforced it. Educational norms sometimes insisted upon it. None of this required conscious orchestration. It was simply the path of least resistance for a majority-oriented world. But history rarely moves in only one direction. As scientific understanding advanced, rigid interpretations softened. The moral symbolism once attached to one side or the other began to fade. Psychological research reframed handedness as variation rather than deviation. Technological innovation allowed greater flexibility in design. modern classrooms and workplaces adapted more thoughtfully to individual differences. Despite these changes, the proportion itself remains stable. That steadiness is perhaps the strongest evidence that handedness is anchored in developmental biology rather than cultural preference. The social environment can influence comfort and expression, but it does not dramatically alter the underlying distribution. From a historical perspective, this stability across continents and centuries is extraordinary. Consider the scale of change humanity has experienced. Migrations across oceans, the rise and fall of empires, revolutions in science and industry, the transformation of communication from ink to digital code. Through all of this, the basic ratio of handedness has remained largely constant. It is a quiet thread running uninterrupted through eras of immense upheaval. There is something almost poetic in that continuity. Handedness does not command attention. It does not dominate headlines or textbooks, yet it shapes daily life in ways both subtle and profound. It influences how tools feel in the palm, how scripts move across pages, how gestures unfold in conversation. It connects modern individuals to ancestors who shaped flint beneath open skies tens of thousands of years ago. In the end, the story of how humans became mostly right-handed is not about dominance in the competitive sense. It is about specialization within a cooperative species. It is about how slight asymmetries, once established, can echo through technology, tradition, and design. It is about how variation persists even within strong majority patterns. And it is about how deep evolutionary currents continue to shape ordinary experience. History often feels distant, confined to monuments, manuscripts, and museum cases. But sometimes it lives in motion, in the quiet repetition of everyday acts. When you write your name, reach for a handle, or gesture while speaking, you are participating in a pattern older than civilization itself. The right-hand majority is not a rule imposed from above. It is the accumulated outcome of neural organization, social imitation, technological reinforcement, and time. A convergence rather than a command. A balance rather than a verdict. And in that simple, steady balance, we see something essential about humanity. We are shaped by both structure and adaptation, by ancient biology and evolving culture, intertwined so completely that even the smallest movement carries the imprint of our shared past. There is a final layer to this story that speaks not just to biology or culture, but to continuity itself. Handedness is one of those rare human traits that has left traces in the archaeological record long before it left traces in writing. Long before anyone described a right or left hand in moral or symbolic terms, the evidence was already present. In stone flakes angled in consistent directions, in muscle attachments subtly more developed on one side of ancient skeletons, in microscopic scratches across fossilized teeth. These fragments, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, converge on the same conclusion. The imbalance is ancient. When historians reconstruct the past, they often rely on dramatic artifacts, monuments, inscriptions, royal decrees. Handedness, by contrast, must be reconstructed from repetition. It is not declared, it is inferred. That makes it, in some ways, a purer signal. It is difficult to fake or exaggerate across continents and millennia. If populations separated by geography and culture display similar proportions of right-hand dominance, the explanation must reach deeper than custom alone. This depth helps explain why the ratio has proven so resilient. Even as modern societies grow more aware of inclusivity, and even as tools become more adaptable, the fundamental distribution remains largely unchanged. That consistency suggests that handedness sits at the intersection of genetics and early development in a way that resists rapid cultural alteration. Social systems may bend, but developmental biology holds steady. And yet, it would be incomplete to treat handedness as purely biological. Its historical significance lies precisely in the way society responded to it. Once the majority orientation became visible, it influenced architecture, military practice, craftsmanship, and ritual. Spiral staircases favored certain defensive movements. Sword grips and shield straps reflected dominant use. Writing desks and ink wells were positioned with an assumed hand in mind. Even greetings, offering the right hand as a sign of peace, became embedded in etiquette. Over time, these accumulated assumptions shaped the physical world. A child born into any given century would encounter tools, furniture, and customs subtly aligned with the majority. Most would never notice the alignment because it matched their own preference. A minority would adapt. In that adaptation lies another quiet testament to human flexibility. The modern era has introduced a new chapter. Neuroscience has mapped hemispheric specialization with increasing precision. We now understand that lateralization supports efficiency in language and fine motor control. We recognize that handedness reflects probabilities, not rigid destinies. We design with awareness rather than assumption. Yet, despite this expanded understanding, the ancient pattern persists. That persistence invites a broader reflection on how human traits stabilize over time. Not everything in history trends toward uniformity. Not everything dissolves into diversity. Some patterns settle into equilibrium, strong enough to coordinate societies, flexible enough to preserve variation. Handedness appears to be one of those equilibria. It also serves as a reminder that history is layered. On one layer, civilizations transform quickly. On another, biological structures move slowly. When those layers interact, culture amplifies what biology initiates. The right-hand majority became embedded not through force, but through alignment between neural specialization and social imitation. In the end, how humans became mostly right-handed is not a story of winners and losers, nor of superiority or deficiency. It is the story of a species shaped by asymmetry, a brain that divided tasks for efficiency, a society that reinforced majority patterns for coordination, and a persistent minority that remained part of the whole. So when you consider your own dominant hand, you are not simply acknowledging preference. You are recognizing the visible edge of an invisible history. That motion carries echoes of ancient toolmakers, early farmers, medieval scribes, industrial workers, and modern researchers. It is a living thread connecting present experience to deep evolutionary time. And perhaps that is the most remarkable conclusion of all. Even the smallest, most habitual gesture can carry within it the weight of humanity's long and steady past. If we take one last, measured look at this subject, we begin to see handedness not simply as a biological trait or a cultural habit, but as a quiet framework through which human continuity can be understood. It is one of the few characteristics that bridges evolutionary prehistory and modern daily life without interruption. Empires have risen and dissolved. Technologies have redefined entire eras. Belief systems have shifted dramatically. Yet the fundamental distribution of handedness has remained strikingly constant. That constancy matters. It suggests that beneath the turbulence of recorded history lies a slower rhythm. Human brains, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years, settled into patterns of hemispheric specialization that proved efficient for communication and tool use. Once established, those patterns required no constant reinforcement from conscious thought. They reproduced themselves naturally through development. In prehistoric times, the advantage of slight asymmetry would have been practical. A dominant hand refined through repetition becomes more precise. Precision improves toolmaking. Better tools improve survival. Survival allows knowledge to be passed on. Over generations, even small efficiencies accumulate. The right-hand majority likely strengthened gradually, not because left-handedness vanished, but because the dominant orientation fits smoothly into cooperative living. As societies expanded, specialization increased. Craft traditions demanded consistency. Writing required fine motor control over long periods. Architectural and mechanical designs reflected the hands that built them. Even subtle aspects of daily life, how a door latch turns, how a plow is guided, how a musical instrument is strung, echo the same statistical reality. These design choices were rarely ideological. They followed practicality. And yet, what is equally significant is that left-handedness endured without disappearing. This persistence reveals something fundamental about human variation. Development is not rigid. It is probabilistic. Multiple genes, prenatal influences, and early neural development interact to produce a range of outcomes. Most individuals fall toward right-hand preference, but a consistent minority does not. That minority remains stable across geography and across centuries. The 20th century provides an especially clear illustration of how culture can influence expression without changing underlying biology. In several Western countries, left-handed children were once encouraged or required to switch. For a time, reported rates appeared lower, but as educational philosophy shifted and pressure eased, the visible proportion rose again, returning to roughly the same familiar range. The reemergence suggests that suppression altered behavior, not development itself. Modern neuroscience has added clarity without disrupting the broader picture. Brain imaging confirms that lateralization supports efficiency in language and sequencing. Most right-handed individuals show left hemisphere dominance for speech, but variation exists. Left-handed individuals often display more diverse hemispheric patterns, reminding us that human cognition resists simple categorization. The brain is specialized, but it is also flexible. In today's digital world, physical asymmetry sometimes feels less consequential. Keyboards distribute tasks across both hands. Touchscreens respond equally to either side. Software interfaces can be customized. And yet, the dominant hand majority still shapes defaults, from the placement of computer mice to the layout of tools in workshops. The ancient ratio quietly persists beneath modern innovation. Ultimately, the story of how humans became mostly right-handed is about convergence over time. Evolution provided the neural foundation. Social imitation amplified it. Material culture reinforced it. Institutions sometimes codified it. Variation persisted within it. No single factor dominates the explanation. Each layer interacts with the others. What remains is a subtle but enduring pattern. a reminder that human history unfolds not only in dramatic events but in steady repetition. The hand you use most often is the product of hemispheric specialization shaped in deep prehistory. It has influenced architecture, craftsmanship, language, ritual, and design without ever being consciously chosen by the species as a whole. In that sense, handedness is a living fossil of human development. It survives quietly in every gesture, linking modern individuals to ancestors who shaped stone tools beneath open skies. It reflects the balance between coordination and diversity that defines our species. And perhaps that is the final insight. The smallest, most ordinary details of our lives can carry the longest histories. In the simple act of reaching, writing, or lifting, we participate in a continuum stretching back beyond memory. A modest preference becomes a testament to how biology and culture have moved together, slowly and steadily, across the immense span of human time. As we reach the far edge of this exploration, there is a quiet realization waiting beneath it all. Handedness is not simply about preference. It is about structure. It is about how the human organism organized itself long before history was written, and how that organization shaped everything that followed. At some point deep in evolutionary time, the human brain intensified its lateralization. Tasks involving language, sequencing, and fine motor precision clustered primarily in the left hemisphere for most individuals. That neurological asymmetry expressed itself outwardly as a dominant right hand. The shift was not dramatic or sudden. It was incremental, reinforced by repetition and learning across generations. Once early humans began relying heavily on tools, this small asymmetry gained significance. Stone knapping required controlled strikes. Carving wood required careful shaping. Preparing food required coordinated slicing and scraping. When one hand consistently led in precision tasks, skill accumulated faster on that side. A dominant hand became more reliable through practice. Reliability improved group efficiency, and efficiency mattered for survival. But survival alone does not explain the durability of the pattern. Social learning magnified it. Humans teach by demonstration. When most adults demonstrate techniques with the right hand, children absorb those movements visually and physically. Over time, majority practice becomes embedded in method. Even without formal rules, imitation stabilizes orientation within a community. As civilizations formed, complexity deepened the reinforcement. Writing systems demanded precise, repetitive motion. Craft guilds required standardized technique. Military coordination depended on predictable movement. Agricultural tools were refined around common grips. Each layer of organized society strengthened the assumption of a dominant orientation. None of this eliminated left-handedness, but it made the right-hand majority structurally convenient. Symbolism followed practicality. In many languages, right came to mean correct or lawful. The left sometimes gathered less favorable associations. These meanings were cultural constructions layered onto a biological pattern. Over centuries, symbolism could harden into expectation. In certain periods and places, children who favored the left hand were encouraged to switch, often for reasons tied more to conformity than science. Yet the underlying ratio endured. Once educational systems relaxed those pressures in the 20th century, the visible proportion of left-handed individuals rose to levels consistent with broader global patterns. That rebound revealed a crucial truth. Biology sets the foundation. Culture can obscure or reveal it, but rarely erase it. Today, neuroscience confirms what archaeological evidence long suggested. Handedness reflects hemispheric specialization, influenced by genetics and early development. It is not absolute, brains remain adaptable, but it is remarkably consistent across populations. Technology now offers greater flexibility, reducing the practical disadvantages once faced by minorities. Still, the ancient distribution persists. In a world that changes rapidly, handedness stands as a reminder of slower forces at work. Beneath technological revolutions and social transformations, certain biological patterns remain stable. They shape daily life in subtle ways, through the design of tools, the layout of desks, the choreography of gestures. They are rarely noticed precisely because they are so constant. The story of how humans became mostly right-handed is therefore not about dominance in a competitive sense. It is about specialization within a cooperative species. It is about how small neural advantages can echo outward into material culture. It is about how societies adapt around majority patterns while still carrying minority variation forward. Perhaps most importantly, it is about continuity. Every right-handed motion today carries a lineage older than writing, older than agriculture, older even than modern humanity itself. That lineage was not chosen. It emerged gradually, shaped by the interplay between brain structure and social living. So when you lift your dominant hand, whether to write, gesture, or simply rest it against a table, you are performing an act rooted in deep evolutionary time. Feels ordinary, feels personal, but it is also collective and ancient. A simple movement, repeated billions of times across generations, quietly tells the story of how biology and culture shaped one another into the pattern we now take for granted. And in that steady, unremarkable motion, we glimpse the long arc of human history itself. As we settle into the final stretch of this journey, it becomes clear that handedness is more than a biological footnote. It is a subtle framework through which we can understand how human traits endure. The overwhelming preference for the right hand is not loud or dramatic. It does not define civilizations in the way agriculture or writing does. And yet, it threads through every era, quietly shaping how those larger transformations unfolded. Think for a moment about the earliest cooperative hunts. Coordination was everything. Timing, shared rhythm, predictable movement, these reduced risk. If most individuals in a group instinctively led with the same side, shared gestures would become more synchronized. Over thousands of repetitions, predictability would reinforce safety and efficiency. The advantage would not have been conscious. It would have emerged naturally from repetition and imitation. As toolkits grew more complex, specialization deepened. Crafting a balanced hand axe, shaping a spear point, weaving fibers into cordage. Each of these tasks required steady sequencing. The brain systems managing those sequences increasingly favored one hemisphere in most individuals. With that came greater refinement in one hand, skill built upon skill. And because human survival relied on transmitting those skills, demonstration favored consistency. Once permanent settlements appeared, new layers of coordination emerged. Agriculture demanded repetitive precision, cutting, grinding, binding, carving. Writing introduced an entirely new form of fine motor discipline. Scribes practiced for hours, their dominant hand guided by scripts that flowed according to established conventions. Over centuries, these conventions became institutional. They were taught deliberately, preserved deliberately, and assumed implicitly. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this story is its restraint. At no point did humanity consciously choose to become right-handed. There was no universal mandate. Instead, a modest neurological asymmetry intersected with social imitation and material design. That intersection was enough. Across immense spans of time, the pattern stabilized. Even when societies misunderstood handedness, attaching symbolic or moral meaning to one side, the biological foundation remained unaffected. The 20th century offered a clear test. In places where left-handed children were once pressured to conform, the visible ratio dipped. When the pressure eased, it returned. This suggests that development sets probabilities early, and culture primarily influences expression. Modern neuroscience reinforces this conclusion. Brain imaging reveals that lateralization supports efficiency in language and fine motor control. The majority orientation appears deeply linked to hemispheric organization established before birth. And yet, diversity remains part of the equation. Left-handed individuals display varied neural patterns, reminding us that uniformity is never absolute. In the digital age, the practical consequences of handedness are less rigid. Interfaces can adapt. Devices can be mirrored. Classrooms are designed with flexibility. And still, the fundamental distribution holds steady. That stability across ancient campsites and modern cities alike underscores how deeply the pattern is woven into our species. What does this tell us about history more broadly? It tells us that some of the most enduring human features are not ideological or political. They are structural. They arise from the architecture of the brain interacting with social cooperation. Once established, they persist quietly beneath visible change. So the next time you reach instinctively with your dominant hand, pause for just a moment. That movement carries within it a lineage that stretches back beyond recorded memory. It connects you to prehistoric artisans shaping stone beneath open skies, to early farmers harvesting grain, to medieval scribes illuminating manuscripts, to industrial workers guiding machinery, to modern designers calibrating digital tools. A simple preference becomes a living fossil of human development. Not dramatic, not celebrated, but continuous. How humans became mostly right-handed is not a tale of conquest or decision. It is a tale of convergence, biology aligning with cooperation, repetition strengthening orientation, culture embedding majority patterns, and variation enduring within the whole. It is one of the quietest stories in human history, and one of the most persistent. In that persistence lies its meaning. Even as the world transforms at breathtaking speed, certain patterns remain steady. Handedness is one of them, a small, steady signal that beneath the surface of change, humanity carries forward ancient structures shaped by deep time. If we allow ourselves one final, careful reflection, we can see that handedness ultimately tells a story about scale. Not geographical scale, not political scale, but temporal scale. It is a reminder that some elements of the human condition move so slowly that they feel permanent, even as everything around them changes. Across tens of thousands of years, climates shifted, coastlines moved, and populations migrated. Technologies advanced from stone to bronze to iron to silicon. Languages were born, flourished, and vanished. Entire belief systems reshaped the moral imagination of continents. And yet, through all of that transformation, the basic distribution of handedness remained astonishingly steady. That stability hints at something foundational. The human brain, long before civilization, settled into a pattern of hemispheric specialization that proved efficient for complex communication and tool use. Once that pattern was established, it became self-reinforcing. Each generation inherited not just genes but neural tendencies. Each child's developing brain quietly echoed an ancient architecture. From there, society did what societies always do. It adapted around what was most common. Tools were shaped for the majority grip. Writing flowed in directions that felt natural for most hands. Rituals and customs incorporated the dominant side into symbolic meaning. None of these choices required a global agreement. They emerged organically as practical solutions within majority contexts. Yet this process never erased diversity. Left-handed individuals appeared in every era, in every region, in every culture. Their presence is documented in skeletal remains, artistic depictions, and written accounts. Even when misunderstood or pressured, the minority persisted. That persistence suggests a deep biological resilience, variation built into development itself. In modern times, we have gained the ability to observe handedness scientifically. Brain imaging confirms that lateralization is widespread but not uniform. Genetic research suggests multiple contributing factors rather than a single determining gene. Developmental studies reveal that preference often stabilizes early in life, long before social expectations fully take shape. These findings reinforce what archaeology and anthropology long implied. Handedness is rooted deeply in our biology. And yet, biology alone does not tell the full story. The human experience of handedness is filtered through culture. A right-handed majority shapes material design almost unconsciously. A left-handed minority adapts, innovates, and sometimes excels in ways that reflect their unique orientation. Over time, society has become more aware of this variation, shifting from rigid conformity toward accommodation. The digital era has softened some of the physical asymmetries that once mattered more. Interfaces can be flipped. Tools can be customized. The dominance of ink on paper has faded. But even here, subtle defaults often echo the ancient majority. The computer mouse sits to the right by default. Many everyday objects are shaped by long-standing ergonomic norms. Through it all, the ratio remains remarkably consistent. Roughly 9 out of 10 humans prefer the right hand for fine motor precision. That number has held across continents and centuries. It is not easily moved by fashion or ideology. It appears to represent a stable balance, strong enough to coordinate society, flexible enough to preserve diversity. And so the story closes where it began, with an ordinary gesture. When you reach for a cup, sign your name, or extend your hand in greeting, you are performing an action rooted in deep evolutionary history. It feels personal, but it is also collective. It feels immediate, but it carries the imprint of time measured not in decades, but in millennia. How humans became mostly right-handed was not a single event. It was not a deliberate choice. It was the gradual convergence of neural specialization, cooperative living, technological reinforcement, and cultural adaptation. A quiet alignment of biology and society, repeated across generations until it became one of the most stable patterns in our species. In the end, handedness reminds us that history is not only written in monuments or preserved in archives. It is written in the body. It lives in motion. And sometimes the smallest movement carries the longest story. If we sit with this idea just a little longer, we begin to understand that handedness is not merely an inherited trait. It is an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present. Every generation inherits a neurological architecture shaped by deep evolutionary time, and then lives that architecture out within its own cultural moment. The structure remains ancient. The context keeps changing. Long before written language, early humans depended on increasingly complex manual tasks. Toolmaking was not random. It required foresight, sequencing, and repeated correction. These cognitive demands likely strengthened lateralization in the brain. When one hemisphere proved slightly more efficient at organizing such sequences, the corresponding hand gained refinement. Over time, this asymmetry became the norm for most individuals. But the key is that this was never absolute. Evolution rarely eliminates variation entirely. A small percentage of individuals continued to develop left-hand preference. Their existence suggests that human development is probabilistic, not predetermined. Multiple genetic and prenatal factors combine to shape neural asymmetry. The outcome is a stable distribution rather than a rigid rule. As societies expanded, the dominant orientation became embedded in shared systems. Consider the spread of literacy. In societies using left-to-right scripts, the mechanics of ink and parchment favored right-handed motion. Over centuries, that practical alignment influenced teaching methods and desk design. In industrial settings, tools were mass-produced with the majority in mind. Even something as simple as the placement of a lever or crank often assumed a right-hand grip. Yet, as scientific understanding improved, so did flexibility. The 20th century marked a turning point in perception. Where once deviation from the majority was discouraged, it gradually became accepted. Psychological research revealed no inherent deficiency in left-handedness. Educational systems adjusted. Accommodation replaced correction. This shift did not alter the biological ratio, but it transformed the social experience of the minority. In the modern digital environment, handedness may feel less visible. Typing distributes labor across both hands. Voice commands bypass manual dominance altogether. Touchscreens respond equally to either side. And still, the ancient pattern persists. The majority remains right-handed, not because of social enforcement, but because development continues to produce that distribution. What makes this story so compelling is its quiet universality. Across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and far beyond, the ratio remains consistent. Across cultures separated by geography and language, the imbalance is similar. This convergence points to a common biological foundation shared by humanity as a whole. At the same time, handedness reflects something deeper about how societies function. Majority traits tend to shape shared spaces. Design follows probability. The world is built, often unconsciously, around what most people do most easily. That does not make the minority invisible, but it does require awareness to ensure fairness and inclusion. And so the long arc of handedness becomes a lesson in equilibrium. Biology sets a tendency. Culture amplifies it. Variation endures within it. Over thousands of years, that balance has remained remarkably steady. It has influenced tool design, writing systems, architecture, ritual, and education without ever requiring a coordinated human decision. When you lift your dominant hand today, you are participating in that equilibrium. The motion feels immediate and personal, but it is also ancient. It carries echoes of prehistoric artisans shaping stone, of scribes guiding quills across parchment, of craftsmen refining their trade. It reflects neural circuits laid down before birth and reinforced through practice. How humans became mostly right-handed is, in the end, a story of convergence and continuity. It is about how small asymmetries can shape entire systems over immense spans of time. It is about how cooperation magnifies probability. And it is about how diversity persists even within dominant patterns. In that simple, steady imbalance, we glimpse a fundamental truth about humanity. We are shaped by forces both ancient and adaptive, biological and cultural, individual and collective. And sometimes the smallest gesture reveals the longest history. As we reach the final edge of this discussion, it helps to see handedness as a thread woven through the entire human story. A thread so consistent that it almost disappears from view. It does not demand attention the way wars or revolutions do. It does not carry the drama of invention or conquest. Yet it has quietly influenced how those events unfolded, shaping the tools, movements, and systems through which history was made. From the earliest chipped stones to the modern keyboard, the majority orientation of the human hand has left its imprint. When prehistoric artisans struck flint cores, their repeated motions strengthened neural circuits tied to one side of the body. When agricultural societies formed, the rhythm of harvesting and grinding reinforced dominant grips. When writing spread across ancient civilizations, scribes practiced strokes that aligned with established patterns of movement. When industry scaled production, ergonomic assumptions reflected statistical reality. At no point was there a single moment of decision. Instead, there was accumulation. A slight evolutionary asymmetry encouraged precision in one hemisphere. Social imitation amplified that bias. Material culture stabilized it. Institutions sometimes codified it. Over immense stretches of time, the pattern settled into equilibrium. And equilibrium may be the most important word here. The dominance of the right hand did not erase left-handedness. It coexisted with it. The minority remained present in every era. Artists, craftsmen, warriors, scholars. Their continued presence suggests that diversity is embedded in the developmental fabric of our species. Variation did not disappear because it likely carried its own subtle advantages, and because genetic and prenatal factors ensure a range of outcomes. Modern research confirms what archaeology long implied. Handedness is shaped by hemispheric specialization established early in development. It is not purely taught nor purely random. It reflects a complex interplay of biology and environment. But what stands out across continents and centuries is its stability. The ratio remains remarkably similar whether we look at prehistoric Europe, ancient Asia, medieval Britain, or contemporary North America and Australia. This constancy invites reflection on how deeply some aspects of humanity resist rapid change. Technology evolves quickly. Social norms shift within decades. Yet certain biological distributions remain steady because they are anchored in development. Handedness belongs to that slower rhythm of history. Even in the digital age, where customization is easy and interfaces are adaptable, the ancient majority persists. The placement of tools, the orientation of controls, the choreography of shared gestures, these still echo long-standing patterns. But unlike earlier centuries, awareness now allows accommodation without stigma. What was once interpreted symbolically is now understood structurally. And perhaps that is the final insight. Handedness shows us how biology and culture intertwine without deliberate planning. A small neurological bias can ripple outward into architecture, ritual, education, and design. Over time, that ripple becomes so normal that it feels invisible. Yet it is there, steady and persistent. When you lift your dominant hand, you are expressing a lineage older than writing itself. That movement connects you to ancient toolmakers shaping stone beneath open skies, to scribes illuminating manuscripts, to engineers drafting blueprints, to programmers typing code. It reflects a neural architecture shaped long before nations existed. How humans became mostly right-handed was not a turning point in history. It was a convergence of brain specialization, cooperative living, and practical reinforcement repeated across generations. A quiet alignment of structure and society that endured while everything else transformed. In the end, the story of handedness reminds us that history lives not only in monuments and documents, but in motion. It lives in the simple, repeated gestures that define daily life. And sometimes the most ordinary movement carries the deepest past. As we come to the true end of this long exploration, there is a certain stillness in recognizing how unremarkable handedness appears on the surface, and how extraordinary it becomes when placed against the scale of human time. It is not a revolution. It is not a discovery. It is not even something most people think about after childhood. And yet, it is one of the most stable biological patterns in the entire story of our species. To understand its significance, we have to remember how much else has changed. Early humans once shaped stone with bare hands under open skies. Later generations forged bronze and iron. Empires rose, governed vast territories, and collapsed. Religious traditions reshaped continents. The printing press transformed knowledge. Industrial machinery reorganized labor. Electricity illuminated cities. Digital technology now connects billions instantly. Through all of this upheaval, through eras of staggering transformation, the ratio of right-hand dominance has remained largely constant. That constancy points to deep evolutionary architecture. Long before civilization, the human brain intensified its hemispheric specialization. In most individuals, the left hemisphere became dominant for sequencing and language-related tasks. Because the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, fine motor skill increasingly concentrated in the right hand. That subtle advantage compounded through repetition and teaching. A slight asymmetry became a widespread pattern. From there, society built around it, not intentionally but naturally. Cooperative hunting, toolmaking, and food preparation favored predictability. Writing systems evolved in contexts where the majority used the same orientation. Craft traditions reinforced dominant grips. Educational institutions transmitted techniques that matched the most common preference. Even gestures of greeting and ritual drew upon what felt normal to most participants. But the story is not one of uniformity triumphing completely. Left-handed individuals have always been present. They appear in skeletal records, artistic depictions, and historical accounts across cultures. Their persistence underscores a fundamental truth about human biology. Variation is resilient. Development produces probabilities, not certainties. Even within strong majority patterns, diversity remains part of the design. The modern era has reframed how we interpret that diversity. Scientific research has removed much of the symbolism once attached to handedness. It is no longer a sign of moral alignment or deviation, but an expression of hemispheric organization. Schools have adapted. Workplaces have become more flexible. Technology now allows customization that previous generations could not imagine. Yet, even with this flexibility, the ancient distribution persists. The majority of humans remain right-handed, not because they are required to be, but because their brains develop that way. Culture may soften the edges of experience, but it does not dramatically rewrite the underlying architecture. In a sense, handedness reveals the layered nature of history. On one layer, human societies change rapidly. On another, biological patterns move slowly and steadily. When those layers interact, we see how small neural asymmetries can ripple outward into architecture, tools, language, and ritual. We see how majority behavior shapes shared environments. And we see how minority variation endures within that structure. So when you extend your dominant hand, whether to write, to work, or simply to gesture, you are performing an act shaped by deep time. It feels personal and immediate, but it is also ancient and collective. That simple movement carries within it echoes of prehistoric artisans, ancient scribes, medieval craftsmen, industrial workers, and modern designers. How humans became mostly right-handed was never a decision. It was the quiet convergence of evolutionary specialization and social reinforcement across immense stretches of time. It is one of the clearest reminders that history does not only live in grand events. It lives in the body. It lives in habit. It lives in the repeated gestures that connect us, silently and steadily, to our earliest ancestors. And in that unassuming motion of the hand, the long arc of humanity continues. If we allow ourselves one final, unhurried reflection, handedness becomes something more than a biological statistic. It becomes a lens through which we can observe how humanity carries its past forward without even realizing it. The dominance of the right hand is not an invention of civilization. It is older than cities, older than writing, older than agriculture. It is a pattern shaped in deep prehistory that has simply continued, generation after generation, beneath every cultural transformation. Picture the earliest toolmakers once more. A small group gathered around a stone core, observing how a skilled member of the group removes flakes with careful, angled strikes. The rhythm of that action is repeated again and again. A slight neurological advantage in sequencing and precision gives one side of the body greater reliability. Over time, reliability becomes habit. Habit becomes expectation. Expectation becomes norm. But this was never enforced by decree. It emerged organically through imitation and repetition. Human beings are natural learners. We copy what works. When most adults in a community demonstrate tasks with the same hand, most children will align their movements in similar ways, unless their own developmental pathways lead them elsewhere. And when that minority pathway appears, it persists quietly, woven into the larger pattern. As societies grew more structured, the environment reflected the majority. Writing desks assumed a certain orientation. Tools were balanced for common grips. Ritual gestures formalized what felt natural. Even architectural design sometimes mirrored the dominant hand's logic. These adaptations were rarely ideological. They followed practicality. The world gradually arranged itself around what most bodies did most comfortably. And yet, even as that arrangement solidified, the underlying biological distribution remained the true anchor. When 20th century education briefly attempted to standardize handedness more strictly, it did not eliminate the minority. It merely suppressed its expression. Once that pressure lifted, the proportion returned to its familiar range. That rebound offers quiet but powerful evidence that handedness arises early in development, shaped by neural architecture long before social rules take hold. Modern neuroscience now allows us to see inside that architecture. Brain imaging reveals how hemispheric specialization supports efficiency in language and fine motor coordination. Genetic research suggests multiple contributing factors rather than a single cause. Developmental studies show that preference often stabilizes early in childhood. Together, these findings confirm what archaeology and anthropology had long suggested. Handedness is deeply rooted in the structure of the human brain. Still, its significance lies not only in biology, but in interaction. The human story is one of cooperation. We survive and thrive by coordinating our actions. A majority orientation simplifies that coordination. It allows shared gestures to feel intuitive. It reduces friction in collective tasks. Over thousands of years, that subtle advantage reinforced itself without conscious planning. Today, technology has softened many practical differences. Tools can be customized. Interfaces can be mirrored. Classrooms can adapt easily. The stigma once attached to minority orientation has largely faded in much of the English-speaking world. Yet despite these changes, the ancient ratio endures. Roughly 9 out of 10 humans remain right-handed, as they have for millennia. And so the story closes not with a dramatic revelation, but with quiet continuity. How humans became mostly right-handed was not a single event, nor the result of cultural preference alone. It was the gradual convergence of evolutionary asymmetry, social learning, material reinforcement, and time. A small neurological bias, amplified gently and steadily across generations. In the end, handedness reminds us that history does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It lives in habits so familiar we stop noticing them. It persists in gestures repeated billions of times across centuries. And when you lift your dominant hand without thinking, without planning, you are enacting a pattern older than recorded memory, a simple motion that carries the weight of humanity's long and steady past. And perhaps the most striking thing, after tracing this long arc, is how completely ordinary it all feels. There is no monument dedicated to the dominance of the right hand. No treaty formalized it. No empire enforced it across continents. And yet it has endured more reliably than borders, governments, and even languages. If we imagine explaining modern humanity to a distant observer, we might describe our technologies, our political systems, our cultural diversity. But we might also mention something quieter, that most of us favor the same hand when performing precise tasks. That small, consistent detail would reveal something profound about our neurological organization and our evolutionary history. Because handedness is not just about preference. It reflects how the brain divides labor. The human brain is metabolically expensive. Specialization improves efficiency. When one hemisphere becomes particularly adept at sequencing movements and processing structured information, it makes sense for the opposite side of the body to refine its motor precision accordingly. Over evolutionary time, that specialization likely conferred subtle advantages in toolmaking, communication, and coordinated activity. But what makes humans unique is not specialization alone. Many animals show individual paw or limb preferences. What distinguishes us is population-level alignment. In most species, left and right preferences are more evenly distributed. In humans, the imbalance is strong and stable. That suggests that our form of social cooperation amplified a biological tendency that might otherwise have remained more evenly split. Human beings learn socially at an extraordinary scale. We copy techniques, gestures, and behaviors across generations with remarkable fidelity. When a majority orientation becomes visible in teachers and leaders, it propagates. The alignment becomes self-reinforcing. A right-handed world feels intuitive to right-handed learners. Tools shaped for the majority reduce friction. Over centuries, the environment itself begins to mirror the dominant hand. And yet, despite this reinforcement, left-handedness never disappears. It remains a steady minority, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes accommodated, but always present. This persistence suggests that diversity is not a flaw in the system, but part of its stability. A small minority orientation may carry occasional strategic advantages, especially in direct interaction. It also reflects the complexity of developmental biology, where multiple pathways can produce viable outcomes. The modern age, with its emphasis on inclusivity and adaptability, has allowed handedness to shed much of its symbolic weight. What was once moralized is now measured. What was once corrected is now supported. But the ratio itself remains largely unchanged, a testament to how deeply rooted the pattern is. Looking back across the sweep of history, from Paleolithic campsites to digital workspaces, the continuity is remarkable. Ancient toolmakers shaped stone with a dominant hand much as modern designers shape code. Medieval scribes guided quills across parchment with the same neurological asymmetry that guides a student's pen today. Industrial workers operated machinery with grips shaped by centuries of accumulated design. The context shifted dramatically. The underlying pattern endured. So in the end, how did humans become mostly right-handed? Not through command or conscious choice, not through cultural preference alone, but through the gradual alignment of neural specialization and cooperative living. A small asymmetry became a shared habit. A shared habit became a structural norm. A structural norm became embedded in material culture. And now it feels so natural that it barely registers. Yet every time you reach, write, or gesture, you participate in that immense continuity. A simple movement becomes a bridge across time, linking modern life to ancient evolution. It is a reminder that history is not only something we read about. It is something we carry quietly in the way we move through the world. As we let this subject rest, one last perspective brings the entire arc into focus. Handedness is, in many ways, a biological memory. Not memory in the sense of conscious recall, but memory embedded in structure. The architecture of the brain carries forward decisions made not by intention, but by natural selection over immense spans of time. When most humans favor the right hand, they are expressing that inherited architecture without needing to think about it. If we trace the pattern backward once more, the key lies in increasing complexity. Early hominins did not simply use tools, they refined them. The refinement required planning, precision, and repetition. A slight neurological edge in sequencing movements would have translated into more consistent results. That consistency improved survival odds, even if only marginally. Over thousands of generations, marginal advantages accumulate. What begins as a subtle tilt becomes a widespread trait. Once language entered the picture, the connection may have deepened. Language is a system of ordered sounds and symbols. It requires timing and coordination. In most individuals, language processing centers concentrate in the left hemisphere. The same hemisphere often governs fine motor control of the right hand. While the relationship is complex and not perfectly uniform, the overlap suggests that cognitive specialization and manual precision develop side by side. From there, society did the rest, not deliberately but practically. Cooperative living favors predictability. Shared orientation reduces confusion. When passing tools, performing rituals, or coordinating in battle, uniform movement simplifies interaction. Over centuries, uniformity becomes embedded in tradition. Tools are built with certain grips. Writing systems flow in particular directions. Furniture, machinery, and even social gestures reflect the statistical majority. And yet, what gives this story balance is the enduring presence of variation. Left-handed individuals have always existed alongside the majority. Their persistence shows that evolutionary systems rarely eliminate diversity entirely. Development produces a range of outcomes, and that range can be beneficial. In some contexts, rarity itself provides advantage. In others, diversity enriches problem-solving and creativity. The minority orientation remains small but stable, a consistent feature of human populations worldwide. The 20th century offered a revealing test of how culture interacts with biology. In periods when left-handedness was discouraged in schools, visible numbers temporarily declined. But once such pressures faded, the proportion returned to its long-standing range. That return illustrates an important principle. Culture can mask biological tendencies, but it rarely rewrites them. Today, as technology evolves rapidly, handedness feels less consequential than it once did. Devices are customizable. Interfaces adapt. Digital tools minimize physical asymmetry, yet the underlying pattern remains. Roughly 9 out of 10 humans prefer the right hand for fine motor tasks, just as their ancestors did in prehistoric camps and medieval workshops. This continuity reminds us that history operates on layers. Political systems change quickly. Cultural norms evolve over decades. But biological structures endure across millennia. Handedness sits at that deeper layer, a quiet, persistent trait linking modern humanity to its earliest ancestors. So when you extend your dominant hand, you are not simply performing a habitual action. You are expressing an ancient equilibrium between brain specialization and cooperative life. That small gesture connects you to stone toolmakers shaping flint, to scribes guiding ink across parchment, to engineers drafting blueprints, to programmers typing lines of code. The context has transformed beyond recognition. The underlying pattern has not. How humans became mostly right-handed is ultimately the story of gradual convergence. Neural asymmetry provided the foundation. Social imitation amplified it. Material culture reinforced it. Variation endured within it. Over immense spans of time, that convergence settled into stability. And in that stability lies a quiet truth. Some of the deepest elements of human history are not written in books or carved in stone. They are written in the body itself, in the subtle asymmetries that shape how we move, create, and connect. If we take one final, expansive view of the subject, handedness becomes a symbol of how humanity carries its origins forward without ceremony. It is not commemorated, debated in parliaments, or marked on calendars. Yet it is present in nearly every deliberate action we perform. It is an inheritance so complete that it feels invisible. Across evolutionary time, the human brain underwent a quiet but profound shift toward specialization. The division of labor between hemispheres improved efficiency. For most individuals, the left hemisphere became dominant for sequencing, structured communication, and the precise timing required for complex tasks. Because neural control crosses to the opposite side of the body, that specialization expressed itself physically through the right hand. This was not destiny written in a single mutation. It was a gradual refinement. Small advantages in coordination and predictability accumulated. In early human groups, where survival depended on shared effort, even slight efficiencies mattered. A dominant hand, refined through repetition, improved toolmaking. Improved tools improved food acquisition and protection. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next reinforced the most common patterns. But what distinguishes humans from other species is not just lateralization, it is shared lateralization. Many animals display individual limb preferences. Few display such a strong population-wide bias. That distinction suggests that social learning amplified the biological tendency. When most members of a group demonstrate a skill with the same hand, imitation strengthens alignment. Alignment reduces friction in cooperative tasks. Over thousands of years, this feedback loop stabilized the ratio. As societies developed writing, agriculture, craftsmanship, and organized warfare, the majority orientation shaped design choices. Scripts flowed in directions that suited the most common grip. Tools were forged with ergonomic assumptions based on dominant hands. Even architectural features sometimes reflected practical advantages linked to right-handed movement. None of this required centralized coordination. It emerged naturally from probability. Yet variation endured. Left-handed individuals appear consistently in skeletal records and historical accounts. Their minority status remained stable across cultures and continents. This persistence suggests that the underlying developmental processes are complex and resilient. Genetics influence probability, but they do not eliminate diversity. Prenatal development plays a role. Neural organization varies. The result is not uniformity, but equilibrium. The modern era has given us the tools to peer into that equilibrium more closely. Neuroscience confirms hemispheric specialization. Developmental psychology shows that hand preference often stabilizes early in life. Sociological research documents how cultural attitudes can influence expression without altering biological distribution. Together, these fields reveal a layered explanation. Biology provides the structure. Culture interacts with it. In many English-speaking societies, the 20th century marked a turning point in perception. Left-handedness, once discouraged in classrooms, became accepted. Accommodations replaced correction. The proportion of self-identified left-handed individuals rose to levels consistent with long-term global patterns. This shift did not create a new distribution. It revealed the one that had always existed beneath social pressure. Today, technology softens practical asymmetries. Digital tools can be mirrored. Devices can be customized. Workspaces can be adapted. And yet, the majority remains right-handed. The ratio holds steady not because of tradition alone, but because development continues to produce it. If there is a final lesson in this story, it is about the interplay between stability and change. Humanity evolves culturally at remarkable speed, but biological structures move more slowly. Handedness belongs to that deeper tempo. It is a quiet constant beneath centuries of upheaval. When you reach for a pen, extend your hand in greeting, or rest your palm against a table, you are enacting a motion shaped by that deep tempo. It connects you to ancestors who shaped stone beneath open skies and to generations who built civilizations with dominant hands guiding tools and scripts. The act feels personal. It is, in fact, collective and ancient. How humans became mostly right-handed was not a single event or conscious choice. It was a convergence of neural specialization, cooperative living, material reinforcement, and the passage of immense time. A small asymmetry became a stable pattern. A stable pattern became woven into culture. Culture evolved, but the pattern endured. In that endurance lies something profoundly human. Even as we transform the world around us, certain elements of our nature remain steady. And sometimes the simplest gesture, the quiet movement of a hand, reveals the longest history of all. If we linger here at the very end, one final thought begins to take shape. Handedness is not just a biological pattern or a historical curiosity. It is evidence that humanity carries continuity in its most ordinary movements. Beneath every technological leap and social transformation, there are traits that remain astonishingly stable. The dominance of the right hand is one of them. When we consider how dramatically human life has changed, from nomadic bands to agricultural settlements, from handwritten manuscripts to digital networks, it is remarkable that the basic distribution of handedness has hardly shifted. Roughly 9 out of 10 people still favor the right hand for fine motor precision. That ratio has endured through climate shifts, migrations, pandemics, industrial revolutions, and world wars. It has crossed continents and languages without losing its balance. This endurance suggests that handedness sits at a deep intersection of biology and cooperation. The human brain's hemispheric specialization likely intensified because it improved efficiency. Language, sequencing, and complex motor planning benefited from concentration in one hemisphere. That concentration expressed itself physically as right-hand dominance in most individuals. Once established, this bias aligned naturally with social living. Predictable movement simplified group coordination. Demonstration and imitation reinforced common technique. Over time, what began as a neural asymmetry became embedded in the material world. Tools were shaped around majority grips. Writing flowed in directions suited to the dominant hand. Ritual gestures formalized familiar orientations. Architecture and military practice sometimes reflected practical advantages linked to right-sided movement. Each of these layers added reinforcement without ever needing central planning. Yet what makes the pattern resilient is not reinforcement alone. It is variation. Left-handed individuals never vanished. Their presence across all eras shows that development remains probabilistic. Genetics influence tendencies but do not eliminate diversity. The brain's organization allows for multiple viable outcomes. And in some contexts, minority orientation may even carry subtle advantages, particularly where unpredictability matters. The 20th century's attempts in some regions to standardize handedness provide a revealing chapter. When social pressure encouraged conformity, visible rates shifted temporarily. But once those pressures eased, the familiar distribution returned. That return underscores a key point. Culture can shape expression, but it rarely rewrites biological structure. Today, in a world shaped by digital tools and adaptive design, handedness carries less practical limitation than it once did. Interfaces can be flipped. Workspaces can be adjusted. Education accommodates rather than corrects. And still, the majority remains right-handed. The ancient equilibrium holds. Perhaps this quiet stability offers a broader lesson about human history. Not all change is linear or dramatic. Some patterns settle into long-term balance because they serve both biological efficiency and social coordination. Handedness appears to be one of those patterns, a subtle convergence between neural architecture and collective living. When you lift your dominant hand, the motion feels immediate and personal. Yet it carries echoes of prehistoric artisans striking flint, of early farmers cutting grain, of scribes guiding ink across parchment, of engineers drafting mechanical plans. The context transformed completely. The gesture remained fundamentally the same. How humans became mostly right-handed was never about superiority or choice. It was about gradual alignment between brain structure and survival, between imitation and efficiency, between individual development and collective habit. Over immense spans of time, that alignment stabilized into one of the most consistent features of our species. And so the story ends where it has quietly lived all along, in the simple act of movement. History is not only written in stone tablets or printed in books. It is written in the body, in the asymmetries we carry, in the gestures we repeat without thinking. The right-hand majority is one such inscription, a living reminder that even the smallest habit can hold within it the depth of human time. As we arrive at the final reflection, it becomes clear that handedness is one of those rare subjects where the conclusion is not dramatic, but deeply grounding. There is no hidden twist, no lost civilization, no dramatic turning point. Instead, there is continuity, quiet, stable, and persistent across the entire span of human existence. When historians look for patterns that define humanity, they often focus on milestones. The control of fire, the rise of agriculture, the invention of writing, the scientific revolution. Yet handedness predates all of them. Before cities were built, before scripts were carved into clay, before myths were recorded, most humans were already favoring the right hand for precise work. That preference was not cultural fashion. It was rooted in the structure of the brain. The human brain evolved toward increasing specialization. Language, sequencing, and complex motor planning concentrated largely in the left hemisphere for most individuals. Because each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body, the right hand became the primary instrument for refined action. Over generations, this neural pattern stabilized. It was efficient. It worked. But biology alone does not explain the strength of the majority. Humans are not solitary creatures. We are intensely social learners. We observe, imitate, and refine together. When most adults demonstrate tasks with the same orientation, that orientation becomes the template for instruction. Tools are built to match it. Techniques are standardized around it. Even rituals reflect it. A small statistical majority becomes a structural norm. Yet this story has always contained variation. Left-handed individuals appear in every era and every region. Their persistence suggests that developmental pathways are flexible and multifaceted. No single genetic instruction determines handedness. Instead, multiple influences, genetic, prenatal, neurological, combine to shape probability. The result is not absolute uniformity, but durable balance. What makes this balance remarkable is its resilience. Across continents, from Europe to Asia, from North America to Australia, the distribution remains similar. Across centuries marked by upheaval and transformation, it barely shifts. Even when cultural pressure attempted to suppress left-handedness in certain periods, the proportion eventually returned to its long-standing range once those pressures eased. In the modern world, handedness has shed much of its symbolic weight. It is no longer widely associated with moral meaning or superstition. Science has reframed it as an expression of hemispheric organization. Technology has reduced many of the inconveniences once faced by minorities. And yet, despite all these cultural adjustments, the ancient ratio persists. This persistence reveals something essential about the layered nature of human history. Some aspects of our existence change quickly: laws, borders, technologies. Others change slowly: biological structures shaped by evolutionary forces. Handedness belongs to that deeper layer. It is a trait that stabilized long before recorded history and has endured through every era since. When you move your dominant hand, you are participating in that continuity. The motion feels ordinary, but it carries extraordinary depth. It connects you to prehistoric toolmakers shaping stone, to early farmers harvesting grain, to medieval scribes illuminating manuscripts, to industrial workers guiding machinery, to programmers typing code in the digital age. The context evolves. The underlying pattern remains. So how did humans become mostly right-handed? Not through decree, not through ideology, not through a single genetic event. It was the gradual convergence of neural specialization and cooperative living. A slight asymmetry proved efficient. Social imitation amplified it. Material culture reinforced it. Variation endured within it. Over immense stretches of time, the equilibrium held. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of this story. In a world defined by change, some patterns remain steady. They do not command attention. They simply persist. Handedness is one of those patterns. A small, almost invisible inheritance that links us to our deepest past. In the simplest gesture, the lifting of a hand, we carry the imprint of evolution, cooperation, and time itself. As we bring this exploration fully to rest, there is something quietly profound in recognizing how little we notice the most stable parts of ourselves. Handedness does not demand explanation in daily life. Feels automatic, neutral, almost invisible. Yet when traced backward, it stretches into a time long before memory, long before civilization, long before language itself took written form. The story begins not with culture, but with structure. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain became increasingly specialized. Dividing tasks between hemispheres improved efficiency. For most individuals, the left hemisphere became dominant for language, sequencing, and precise motor planning. Because the brain's hemispheres control opposite sides of the body, this specialization translated into greater dexterity in the right hand. At first, this was simply a biological tendency. But humans are not solitary beings. We learn by watching. We refine skills together. When most members of a group demonstrate techniques with the same hand, imitation aligns naturally. A child observing a parent shaping a tool will mirror the movement they see most often. Over generations, the majority preference strengthens, not by force but by repetition. As societies became more complex, the reinforcement deepened. Agriculture demanded rhythmic, repeated motion. Craftsmanship required careful precision. Writing required consistent strokes across long hours of practice. Tools were designed with ergonomic assumptions shaped by probability. Even social rituals incorporated the dominant side into gestures of greeting or oath-taking. The world slowly arranged itself around what most bodies did most easily. And yet, variation persisted. Left-handed individuals appear consistently across archaeological findings and historical accounts. Their presence in every era demonstrates that development is not uniform. Genetics contribute, but do not dictate with certainty. Prenatal development shapes outcomes, but allows for diversity. The minority orientation remains stable across continents and centuries. The modern era offers a revealing contrast. When educational systems once pressured left-handed children to switch, visible rates temporarily shifted. But once that pressure lifted, the familiar distribution returned. This rebound suggests that handedness is anchored in early neural organization rather than social conditioning alone. Today, technology has softened many of the practical consequences of dominance. Digital interfaces can be customized. Tools can be mirrored. Workspaces can adapt. But even with this flexibility, the majority orientation remains remarkably steady. Roughly 9 out of 10 people continue to favor the right hand for fine motor tasks. That stability tells us something important about history itself. Not all change is rapid. Beneath revolutions and inventions lie deeper biological continuities. Handedness belongs to that deeper layer, a quiet inheritance shaped long before written records began. When you extend your dominant hand, whether to write, to work, or to greet someone, you are enacting a movement shaped by evolutionary time. It feels personal, but it is also collective. It connects you to ancestors who shaped flint tools, to scribes who illuminated manuscripts, to engineers who drafted plans, to programmers who type lines of code. How humans became mostly right-handed was not a dramatic turning point. It was the gradual alignment of neural specialization and cooperative living. A small asymmetry became a stable norm. A stable norm became woven into culture. Culture evolved, but the asymmetry endured. And so the conclusion is quiet. In the smallest, most familiar gesture, the lifting of a hand, we see the long arc of humanity. A simple motion carries the imprint of evolution, imitation, design, and time. It reminds us that history is not only something we study. It is something we carry subtly and continuously in the structure of our own bodies.